Welcome to Kazakhstan American Corner program. And, before we move to our guest speaker, let me give the floor to our U.S. Consul General, Eric Meyer, who will introduce our guest speaker. Please, Eric.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, Steven. Well, this is Eric Meyer. I'm the U.S. Consul General here in Almaty, and it really gives me it's really a great honor to introduce in far fewer words than really appropriate and necessary the renowned polymath, and that's a universal genius. Steven is a poet, a painter, an author, a teacher, a molecular biologist, and the New York Times acclaimed Genius Philosopher, Steven Friedman. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think that was way too many words, but thank you again. First, I want to thank Tracy and Elmira for arranging this. They're with the U.S. Consulate in Almaty, and I want to thank Eric, the Consul General, for helping facilitate this also. I want to say a few things about the format. I've actually been given some questions about, 10 questions or so that kind of correspond to the topic, in the title. The idea behind those questions was to keep me sort of on track, keep me on, starting on Earth, not ending up on Neptune or some remote, location. I think it might be helpful, almost as if the questions could serve as like, chapter titles or guideposts. I'll probably read the question to respond to it, just to keep people sort of oriented, to what's going on. I think that might be helpful. Otherwise, this is not scripted. Philosophy at its best cannot be done in a scripted format. It's specific to time and place and circumstance. That's part of the nature of the philosophical enterprise. We'll kind of see more about how and why, as I talk. But okay, first question, the overarching question that I want to deal with is, what is philosophy? Actually, and my printer broke, so I'm going to have to read the questions off my phone, which might sort of help justify the Steve Jobs comment that he would trade all his technology for an afternoon with Socrates. Since technology can break, Socrates tended not to. So the first question, the overall question that I want to address, what is philosophy and what is its application to the current COVID-19 pandemic? Okay, now, it's really two questions. The first part of the question, what is philosophy, is my favorite thing to respond to and could occupy the entire time of this session. But I'm going to try to sort of keep it a little more narrowly focused. It's, don't feel that you need to be well-versed in the nature of the subject from the outset. I was supposed to be in, before COVID-19 sort of encapsulated the planet, I was going to be in Kazakhstan and giving talks right now, actually. So in about January, I decided to, like in preparation for some of the talks I was going to be giving, go over to a local college and talk to a few philosophy professors, see if I could arrange to talk maybe to their classes, just to practice. So there were two professors that I encountered. One was the chairman of the department, and the building of the philosophy department, was housed in was the humanities and social sciences building. So I walked into their offices and I said, actually, I know philosophy is in this building, but it's not a humanities, and it's really not a social science. In fact, it's not even a physical science. And I kind of went on to say that I'm not sure that I've encountered someone who I think has a real sense of what philosophy is, even at the university level. And of course they asked me, okay, what is it? And I said, the limit of rigor. That's philosophy. All philosophy cares about is establishing what's incontestable, incontrovertible, what can't possibly be denied. That's one of the reasons why philosophy is such a refuge in times of stress or crisis. It is the one human enterprise that establishes at the limit of rigor what cannot possibly be denied. It is the ultimate certainty, the ultimate security. Now, that begs the question, I think, what is rigor? I think the best way to illustrate it, briefly, is in terms of what rigor is not. We think sometimes that science is a rigorous kind of undertaking, but the fact of the matter is, science is really what we might call a mythology. Not that science is a fantasy, not that it's wrong, not that it's not powerful. Mythologies traditionally have been powerful. The Egyptian mythologies helped guide the construction of the pyramids. And the pyramids were the most impressive human edifice for almost 5,000 years until the Eiffel Tower. But the reason that science is a mythology is that its fundamental propositions cannot be rigorously validated. And this is sometimes not fully appreciated, but is a key aspect to the difference between science and philosophy. We hear these days that, for example, we're trying to develop vaccines or therapeutics against COVID-19. And there have been some suggestions that drugs like hydroxychloroquine might be effective, anti-malarial drug. But the issue is, have they been tested? And in order to test them, we need to do controlled experiments. Controlled experiments are at the core of science. And in a controlled experiment, you take one thing, you take basically an identical thing, you do one thing to the first, a different thing to the other. You have two people with similar cases of COVID-19. You give one chloroquine, you give the other a placebo, and you see what happens. And you try to make those two individuals as similar as possible. And you try to do it in what's called a double-blind way, so that the person doesn't know which drug or placebo, whether they be given a drug or a placebo, and the actual researcher doesn't know who's being given what. That's called the gold standard of controlled experimentation. And until we do those kinds of experiments, we can't draw what we are told are rigorous conclusions. We can't draw rigorous conclusions in science because we cannot, in principle, do a controlled experiment. And we can't, in principle, do a controlled experiment, but again, at the limit of rigor, for a simple but profound circumstance. If you look around, the most obvious thing that you'll notice about the world is it's different in different directions. And so a person standing here, an identical person standing here, those two individuals are not under identical circumstances, just because the world is asymmetric. It's different in different directions. So at the limit of rigor, which is what philosophy occupies, you cannot do a convincingly controlled experiment. You cannot draw a definitive, rigorous conclusion. You can't ever know within the realm of science. One of the things that points to is, for philosophy, everything matters. Everything matters in absolute detail. And it turns out, in terms of rigor, what matters most is difference. Any difference between any two situations, individuals, circumstances means that whatever might rigorously be true of one need not rigorously be true of the other. This applies to everything in our lives, and it applies to how philosophy kind of liberates us from circumstance. For example, you hear death and taxes are certain. We imagine death to be a certainty. There's an early philosophical kind of syllogism, a logical argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. How do you know? The fact that every human being up until now has died does not bear upon your situation, because your situation is characterized by at least one difference between anyone who came before and yourself. We exist by virtue not of our similarity to other things, but by virtue of our differences. If we were identical in every way to something else, we would be that thing. We exist by virtue of our differences. We enjoy our dignity by virtue of our differences. We enjoy our singularity and individuality by virtue of our dignity, of our differences, and we escape whatever we imagine to be true for others by virtue of our differences rigorously. So philosophy inhabits this realm of absolute rigor, where any difference between you and anyone else means that what is applied to anyone else need not apply to you. Where others have failed, you can succeed. There's that famous saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. This is wrong. And it's wrong simply because you can't do the same thing over and over, even if you tried. Not in this world, not in this reality. And it turns out that the fact that you can't is more important than that you almost might be able to. There's a famous short story by Václav Havel, who was former president of the Czech Republic. He talked about a young boy who relentlessly bangs his head against a wall, and everyone thinks him mad, until one day, the wall comes down. The battering ram proves that we can not do the same thing repeatedly, and persistent effort can, in fact, give different results. And that's true for all of our circumstances. So philosophy sees our freedom and our salvation ultimately in what distinguishes us from everything else. There was an article in relation to the COVID situation about Shakespeare, who had written King Lear during the time of a plague in Europe. And a lot of things, plagues were common historically, and lots of great works were done during plague years when people couldn't sort of participate in general social activities. They were confined to their study. Newton developed his work on gravitation during a plague year. The author of this article talked about Shakespeare's emphasis upon individuality, on the value, the worth of the individual. But what's interesting is he didn't point to the most important line in King Lear, and possibly the single most important line philosophically in all of Shakespeare. It's a line from the counselor to King Lear, Kent, to the king, Kent to Lear. I'll teach you differences. It's in the nature of the differences in our circumstances to all other circumstances that turns out to be a path to freedom and to infinite possibility. But okay, so philosophy deals with rigor, deals with incontestability. It's this emphasis upon rigor that allows us to sort of free ourselves from a lot of the presuppositions or claims that we suffer from unnecessarily. The Western philosophical tradition really begins with Socrates, and it begins with Socrates's being condemned to death by the Athenian court for having corrupted the youth of Athens with his teachings. And as Socrates leaves the court, he bids farewell to his friends, and he bids farewell with the words, "And so we go our separate ways, you to live, and I to die. And which is better, only God knows. But we think we know, desperately, erroneously, every moment of our suffocating lives and suffer. It's really very simple. So simple that only Socrates understood. One way to sort of summarize this is we suffer not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. Now, what philosophy attempts to achieve with this focus on rigor is what the religions have aspired to, at their limit. Christianity, at its limit, aspires to mystical union with God, where right here, right now, you become one with God and achieve a solution to all human problems. For Buddhism, it's enlightenment, it's nirvana, it's the recognition that this world, in all of its suffering, all of its pain, is, when seen correctly, nirvana, the complete solution. It's the conception of Eden. Well, it turns out that at its limit, philosophy is able to bring us to that point, bring us to the point where everything around us is not the world that we see, but in fact, the world of Eden, but only at the limit of rigor. And that's the ultimate sort of ambition, but reaching that limit takes some work. We'll talk about, I think, some of the elements of that, tonight. But so on the one hand, philosophy is only interested in what's incontestable. On the other hand, it turns out that what is incontestable turns out to achieve what the religions have most aspired to. So clearly, like Buddhism wanted to end disease, old age, and death right here, right now. Philosophy aspires to the same. If philosophy can do that right here, right now, at the limit of rigor, then we can see how philosophy can address this sort of the issues associated with COVID and all of the anxieties and despairs and concerns. But I'm going to develop that, I think, as we go into these additional questions. So that's kind of just in the way of introduction. Philosophy deals with the limit of rigor. The limit of rigor deals with the nature of differences between each thing, each individual, each set of circumstances. Because of those differences, what is applied to anyone need not rigorously apply to someone else. That even includes issues of mortality. The fact that others have died means that death does not mean that death is certain, rigorously, for anyone, because any difference between any individual means, and someone else suffering a particular fate means that that first individual need not rigorously experience that fate. Now, obviously, we're talking about an extreme sort of position, an extreme vision. But that's the nature of solutions to the world. That's the nature of the religions. That's the nature of something operating at the limit of rigor. 1 nanometer short of that, and you're in this sort of world of common sense. You have to be at that extremity to sort of experience what I'm describing. Okay. The next question is about philosophy in relation to mental health. How is philosophy connected to mental health? First, we should kind of get a sense of what mental health is. Briefly, mental health represents an appropriate response to circumstance. Mental illness represents an inappropriate response. Now, obviously, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate can be a little bit sort of variable depending upon who's doing the evaluating, but let me give you an example of how this kind of plays out in terms of mental health professionals and how we sort of view mental health within a sort of a medical or a psychological context. When I was in medical school, at the beginning of my sophomore year, second year, I was in distress. I was in medical school, which is stressful. I was going through a divorce, and my best friend in medical school had just died of cancer, beginning of the second year. So I was a little bit out of sorts. When you're in medical school, you have access to all kinds of services. So I decided to go and talk to a psychiatrist just to see what his assessment of the situation was. And I would do that periodically, partly just to get like the perspective, you know, of various healthcare professionals, whatever. I mean, I had been doing philosophy, so I was accustomed to seeking out different perspectives. I wanted to see what the psychiatric response would be to my circumstances. So I go into the psychiatrist's office. It was a man, I think in his 50s or so, seemingly intelligent. You know, I had a favorable feeling about him. He asked me what what brought me to him, and I told him, well, you know, I'm sort of feeling a lot of, you know, distress now. I'm in medical school. I'm going through a divorce, and my best friend in medical school just died. And he was like, okay, well, if I were going through that, I would be under severe stress too. Do you drink? Because I would be drinking. So I said, no, I don't drink. Well, would you like a prescription for Valium, a tranquilizer? Because honestly, under those circumstances, I would be stressed, and there's nothing further to say about it. Stress is appropriate. Now, that in general is the measure of mental health. You can be stressed. You can be in despair if it's considered appropriate to the circumstance in general, whatever, you know, again, whatever the measure of appropriateness is. That's not good enough for philosophy. Philosophy would like to have stronger responses to all circumstances, so that whatever state we're in, whatever state of distress, we can basically make the emotion associated with it voluntary. I see philosophy as operating a little bit like a switch that you can sort of enjoy the ride or experience life at its extremes. You can experience the extremes of happiness. You can experience, if you like, the extremes of pain and trial and tribulation. Because I feel it's appropriate to embrace life as it presents itself. There's a philosophical school called Stoicism. You might have heard, you know, someone might be stoical. That means they're not highly emotional in response to circumstances. That was a very appealing philosophical school, you know, throughout a lot of history. There have been famous Christians like Albert Schweitzer in the 20th century who felt that Stoicism was the strongest alternative to Christianity, and the one that he almost embraced. But for me, Stoicism, the idea of muting your emotions so that, you know, circumstances became more bearable, was not appealing. I wanted something stronger. I wanted something that would allow me to experience the extremes of circumstances. If you were, you know, in a movie, you know, that was taking you through all kinds of extremes of emotion. But if the circumstances became overwhelming, I wanted to have the resources, the philosophical resources that, like a switch, could turn off the pain, mute the anxiety, make it voluntary. For example, when I was an only child, when my father, who was my last close relation, was dying, I was actually writing a lot of philosophy, and I was very much within sort of a philosophical perspective When I first heard the news that he had melanoma, and it was serious, and it wasn't clear that he would survive, initially, I didn't have a strong emotional response because I was deep within this sort of philosophical realm that I was developing. That was not satisfactory to me. I wanted to remove myself from that so I could experience, like, my father is dying, you know, as it deserved to be experienced. I didn't want to be sort of muted to the process. It took me about 24 hours to get myself out of that philosophical state of mind. And in the next 3 months of the dying process, I was able to deal with it in its full human terms. Then he passed away. I actually had the flu, so I couldn't be at the hospital. They were keeping me away because they were hoping that he would be able to recover from a pneumonia that he had, and so they didn't want my potentially exposing him to even more illness. So I had to stay in a hotel a little distance from the hospital, and I received a call, you know, that he had passed. I was upset. I had a normal human reaction to the loss of my last close family member. But then, as I was developing the philosophical work, I took advantage of opportunities like this to test it, just to see, like, was it strong enough that even in the midst of that degree of mental and emotional anguish, it could rise to the occasion and, like a switch, make my suffering voluntary. So I remember lying in bed for about 20 minutes, feeling the emotion, and then as a test saying, okay, let me, and what I would do in those days, I write philosophy aphoristically, concentrated statements. The riddle of the world is an object. God is a skeptic, generating time. Very concentrated expressions of philosophical results. I've written about maybe 18,000 such aphorisms now, basically approaching the nature of philosophy and the solution to philosophical problems from all different directions. I don't even remember at this point what aphorism, and in those days I would run an aphorism through my mind to sort of turn the philosophy on and control the degree of pain that I might have been experiencing. I don't remember honestly what the aphorism was because I didn't have to get past the first few words of it, and suddenly, like a switch, I was okay, the pain was gone. The emotional anguish was gone. That's something that I've experienced repeatedly in terms of the power of philosophy to deal with the concrete circumstances of human pain and suffering. From the outside, when I first started to write philosophy, I had no sense that it would have that kind of power. I was only interested in writing propositions that were incontrovertible, that could not possibly be denied. Things like the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. Oh, I'll discuss that maybe a little bit more later. But it wasn't clear to me that there was any direct or necessary connection between that rigorous account of the world, that set of propositions that were absolutely certain no matter what, and our pain and suffering. It wasn't clear that there was any ability of philosophy, just as a kind of a rigorous enterprise, to bear upon human pain and suffering. And in fact, I should tell you this, the first time I experienced that was something also that relates to this whole issue of mental health, human pain and controlling that pain. One of the main phobias I had, and phobias are things that, you know, within the realm of mental health represent irrational responses, right, to circumstance. We have pain or fear that's out of proportion to the threat. So my main phobia when I was younger was acrophobia, fear of heights. But it wouldn't manifest itself when I was on an elevation looking down. I could be on the Empire State Building looking down and be okay because I could see ground. And even if that ground was far away, the fact that I could see it sort of eased my mental state. I would experience the symptoms of acrophobia. I would get my queasy. I would get kind of almost like experience a little bit of vertigo, feel dizzy. When I would be on a slight elevation, it could even be just a staircase, and look up. I could be in an airplane and look down to the ground from 35,000 feet and be fine. I couldn't look out the window and look up and see like nothing, empty sky. That was the form that my acrophobia took. Okay, so I used to live in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, and there was an intersection that had some tall office buildings. It was actually where the old Sherman Oaks Galleria was, that was featured in a lot of movies in the 80s. So there were some like 24-story buildings on the corner that were tall, you know, by Los Angeles standards, at least at the time. Well, I went there one day and I walked up a little staircase and I started looking up, you know, at these tall skyscrapers, tall for, again, by LA standards. And I began to feel my acrophobic response. And just as an experiment, I decided to run an aphorism through my mind just to see what effect it might have. This was before I knew that philosophy had any effect on human suffering, on stress, on anxiety, on pain. Well, the aphorism I chose was one that I had recently written. It goes, selflessness, how one acts, not out of need. Okay? Basically, it relates to what I was saying before in terms of rigor, that we can't really know our needs. In order to like fully assess that, and again, this will sound extreme, but we may know that somebody else needs oxygen, but in our case, we can't know that rigorously. So I ran that aphorism through my mind as I was experiencing these, like the full set of symptoms of acrophobia, and in an instant, like a switch, dissipated. They were gone. I was like, whoa. And what was just as compelling, they didn't return. So I started, now this was not an expected result. I would not necessarily have thought that the limit of rigor, incontestability, what we could know with absolute certainty, would have that kind of effect upon a mental state, on a phobia. Now, it's not impossible, clearly, that a thought could have an effect like that in the sense that we take drugs, we take antidepressants, various kinds of medications to help control like psychiatric symptoms. So clearly, well, drugs are chemicals. Our brain is kind of electrochemical, but so are thoughts. And so it's not impossible that thoughts could have as strong an effect upon our brain, upon its biochemistry, its electrochemistry, as any drug that we might develop. Well, I found repeatedly that that aphorism, and others, but that one in particular, it worked, so I kept using it, was effective in all kinds of circumstances, acting like a switch to turn off whatever the symptoms were. And those symptoms could even include ones of physical pain. There was one day, I'm a visual artist, and one of the things, I do like acrylic poles that I paint on the reverse. And there was a time when I was working in my garage when I had a house, and I was making a metal base for one of these large poles. The pole was like 3 inches in diameter by 6 feet tall. And I was making a metal base out of steel, and it was a square piece of steel with a hole drilled in the middle that the pole could fit into, and the corners of the steel base were really sharp. You know, like the edges were kind of razor sharp. I was sort of like trying, you know, I was kind of buffing them down, but the corners were sharp. I was sort of working in my basement, working in my garage. I kind of got a thought. I had some books in the garage I wanted to refer to. I went over to look at one of the books, and then I ran back towards the base, and I don't know, wasn't paying attention, and the ball of my foot went into the corner of the base. Well, our feet are especially sensitive because we are bipedal. We, for any kind of animal, that animals in general have to move in order to feed, right? We're not like plants, like antennas that can just position ourselves in the ground and photosynthesize. We need to seek food. So our feet are sensitive so that we can sort of defend ourselves against injury that could easily be fatal. Well, what was interesting was, as a test, and at this point I had developed the philosophy even further and further, I said to myself, just the philosophy. The pain went away, and it didn't come back. Again, it's not necessary from a purely philosophical standpoint that that happened, but it turns out ultimately to be part of the nature of what a rigorous solution to the world achieves. It solves not just the problem of enumerating propositions that are absolutely certain, but it tends to have the power over everything else in our experience. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a sense of so in the world in general, mental health issues are seen as those that represent inappropriate responses to stresses, to circumstances. Philosophy has a higher standard. It wants to make everything, all types of suffering, voluntary. Okay, next question. Stress, I go to my phone, let me read the question. Why is philosophy important during times of stress and in the current situation? Okay. Just like with mental health, we should have a sense initially of what stress is, what stress does. Stress helps us survive. It's a survival response, in the same way as pain helps us survive. We experience pain, physical pain now, when there's something wrong that needs to be attended to. If we want to survive longer, it is in our interest not to dismiss the pain, but to address it, to find out what's causing it and have that attended to, have it remedied. Stress is a similar type of adaptive response to circumstance. The animals in the world that are prey have the highest levels of stress hormones in their system, in their circulation, because it's the means by which they survive. They are constantly stressed because they are constantly on alert, for threats to themselves. So stress is really an adaptive response. It's something that helps us survive, in the same way that pain is something that helps us survive. The world actually divides into two main directions of enterprise. There are those things that help us survive. Those things include most everything about our lives and our institutions. Science exists to help us survive, help us manipulate the world. Science does not exist to paint a rigorous picture of reality. As I said earlier, it can't do that. It doesn't rise to that level. It doesn't have that type of claim that it can make. It can't do, in principle, a rigorously controlled experiment. Okay? So science exists not to paint a picture of reality, but to create useful results, to create useful technologies. And that's the test of science, that it helps us in this world, it helps us survive. in the way that stress helps us survive, respond to threats, in the way that pain helps us respond in the face of physical threats. Well, the philosophy goes in the other direction. Philosophy, at the limit of rigor, doesn't help us survive. It turns out that philosophy has this power over pain, power over suffering, to make it into a switch. That's what rigor does. That's not in the interest of our survival, right? If I have a pain, medically, I'd like to attend to it. The fact that philosophically I can turn it off doesn't help me survive. What philosophy achieves is what the religions achieve, which is, to use a religious term, a kind of an extreme term, salvation. A complete solution so that all the problems right here, right now, disappear, including the pain, including the suffering. So stress has value, stress has utility. One of the things about science, I should mention, science exists to create things. If our physics did not lead us to building bridges that could support us, we would replace that physics. Physics has to serve our fundamental interests in terms of making things, creating things, building things. Otherwise, we will look elsewhere. The same thing for molecular biology. I've done molecular biology. One of the practical sort of solutions to what we're facing right now, the COVID crisis, is offered ultimately by molecular biology. I mean, there was an early aphorism I wrote, one aspect of mortality may be summarized, our hope lies with the manipulators of genes. Well, the COVID crisis puts us in a period of global crisis, global war, effectively, against this contagion. War has always stimulated and motivated technological advance more than any other time in human life, and that's because it's life and death. There's more at stake during war. If you look at a lot of our modern age was created by or out of World War II. The epic nature of that struggle led to radar, computers, the atomic bomb, atomic energy, rockets. A lot of modern technology came out of that conflict. That's been true historically. It's true for this now. It's not clear at the moment that we're going to be able to develop a vaccine against, like, the COVID virus, coronavirus. We might, but we don't have a vaccine against AIDS. It's a different kind of virus presenting different kinds of issues, but we don't. We don't have a vaccine against SARS, the first SARS. We don't have a vaccine against MERS. We don't have a vaccine against a lot of cold viruses. So it's not essential, it's not obvious that we're going to be able to achieve that. But in this time of pressure and kind of pressure that warfare sort of generates, I'm expecting a molecular biology advance. I'm expecting that molecular biology will rise to the occasion, and there will be some innovations, and we will have appropriate therapeutics. We will have appropriate vaccines emerging out of this. And if we don't, then we're going to need to seek a new molecular biology. Because if molecular biology can't rise to that occasion, we need better. So the test of science, the test of even society or social institutions is to help us survive. The test of philosophy is to solve the world here and now and put us in the circumstance of Eden here and now. Again, an extreme solution that only emerges at the limit of rigor. Okay, next question. Let me see. American philosopher and psychologist William James once said, "The greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another." What thoughts do you think will be helpful to the majority of people during the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, I've already kind of mentioned a few. One of those overarching thoughts that I like is, we suffer not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we think we know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. It's kind of again, a sort of a blanket sort of like proposition. I mentioned selflessness, how one acts not out of need. That's the kind of thing that helped me deal with my own sort of phobias. In general, I mentioned that I have like something on the order of 18,000 aphorisms. I never know what aphorism might sort of connect, to a given individual. But I am, one that comes up actually, that's in sort of the context of dealing again with these major issues, major kinds of stresses that we're facing, is something about the nature of time. And I mentioned it earlier, the past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. In terms of the past not being able to guarantee the future, well, the future hasn't happened yet. So in principle, from where we stand, it can take any possible form. If you believe in a God, then you believe in some powerful agency that's at least able to decide that the future will take a different direction than you might be imagining. It's within the power of that entity. So if you believe in a God, past can't guarantee the future. That would be, to think that it would be to presume against the power of that God, okay? If you believe in science, you can't claim that the past will guarantee the future. So all science is doing is generalizing from the past. It doesn't know that what is true in the past will necessarily be true in the future. And rigorously, any difference between circumstances in the past may mean that what has been true in the past need not be true in the future. All science is doing is observing what has been true and just assuming it will continue to be so. That's an assumption. Philosophy doesn't admit of assumptions like that. That's not rigorous. And then philosophy, clearly, whatever we haven't experienced can take any possible form. There's that famous philosophical question: what happens if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to observe? Does it make a sound? What's the philosophical response to that? The scientific response is, well, of course, because we have our physics, and our physics sort of sees the world from the outside and assumes that our presence in the world is not having a strong effect upon the world itself or the phenomena that are taking place when we're not present. For philosophy, if you're not experiencing something, if you don't have direct knowledge of it, well, you can't make a claim about it, not rigorously. And so as far as philosophy is concerned, if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to observe, it can do anything or nothing. That tree can turn into chocolate falling into a bed of marshmallows. And then when somebody appears, it suddenly transforms back into wood and ground, as far as we can ever know. The strangeness of quantum mechanics, like that branch of physics that deals with the nature of things on a very sort of subatomic level, the strangeness of what's imagined to be taking place there is due to the fact that we don't have the ability directly to observe subatomic phenomena without disturbing it. And so whatever we can't directly observe, whatever we can't directly experience can rigorously take any possible form. That's true for the future. So, past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. What does that mean? Well, another major philosophical question that people raise is this world real or is it a dream? Okay. The answer to that is, if one day, tomorrow, the next day, we wake up to a totally different reality, and again, it's possible, rigorously, it's possible, we can't make a claim, a rigorous claim against the future. If we wake up to a totally different reality and that reality persists, this was dream. Reality is a term of comparison. If you think that certain things in the past are absolutely like fixed and certain and can't ever change, it's only because you're not imagining a sufficiently different direction that the future may take. And you have no way of knowing it. And to claim it, you can claim all you like about the course that the future will take. Make such claims, you will, in one way or another, to some degree or other, suffer. Anytime, philosophically, anytime you make claims that exceed what you can legitimately know, you open yourself up to suffering. So, past can't guarantee the future decides the past. That's a very powerful, actual response. It means that no matter what you're experiencing now, the future can take a different direction and can even reverse it. And here's an example of how that applies even to things well beyond the nature of what we're experiencing now. Something way beyond the level of pain and suffering that the coronavirus is causing. I was once meeting with a rabbi, a prominent rabbi of a large temple in Los Angeles. It was a meeting that was set up by actually a student of mine who was interested in my philosophical work and was finding it compelling. His parents were concerned, they didn't understand it, and they thought, maybe it's a cult. So I told my student, I asked my student, who do your parents respect most, like intellectually? And they said, well, if so-and-so rabbi. So I said, okay, arrange a meeting. And I'll talk with the rabbi and he'll see this isn't a cult. So he did, and I had about an hour and a half session with him. It was fascinating. And we were talking about the nature of human suffering and responses to it. And as I've already indicated, philosophy has responses. At that limit of rigor, philosophy is capable of controlling suffering, even physical pain, almost like a switch. So I was explaining that. And the rabbi's initial response when I was talking to him about making pain voluntary in that way was, I like my pain, he says. Well, he later apologized for that. But the reason he made that comment was within Judaism, there wasn't a clear response like philosophy provides at its most robust to stark physical suffering. You are physically suffering because it is God's will, or it's God's plan. As I said, philosophy makes that even that level of pain voluntary. But then he asked me, what about the Holocaust, which is obviously represents a level of human suffering that is equal to anything in human history. And what I wanted to say, based on what I've been telling you, I thought would get me thrown out of his office as a Holocaust denier, at least thrown out of his office. But I decided I would say it anyway. I told him, the future decides if it ever occurred and has power to reverse. Amazingly, he didn't throw me out of the room. he was quiet after that. And then he said the last thing I would expect him to say, which was, that is what the Messiah is supposed to say. Now, I am not the Messiah. Philosophy does not embrace that concept. Philosophy doesn't need that concept, because philosophy itself, at the limit of rigor, is able to express those thoughts, those ideas that have, if you like, messianic power. But it's just philosophy operating at the limit of rigor. Similar thing occurs to me. And actually, it's going to lead into something else. Perspective. Okay, I think, so that gives you a sense of the power of aphorisms, the power of philosophical insights, like past can't guarantee future, future decides the past, to help stabilize our circumstance, make us calm within the storm, if you like. And make, as I said, when it's fully assimilated, when it's fully understood, when it's fully practiced, and when you are fully inside these ideas and embracing rigor, at its limit, makes suffering voluntary, makes it like a switch. Okay, the next question, and actually that leads into, I was about to say leads into this question, is about perspective. Philosophy cultivates a trait that is beneficial for everyone. Perspective. What is your opinion on this statement? Where to begin, and what will be the first steps to start enriching your perspective? Okay, perspective is a very interesting sort of concept. There are two ways that we can see it. There's sort of an original view of perspective. If you look it up like in a dictionary and look at the origin of the word, it means to look closely at things. That is the philosophical type of, that's what philosophy can embrace, that looking closely where everything matters. The other type of perspective, the way that word, I think the concept is usually used, especially these days, is in terms of seeing things from other people's perspective. Seeing things from, if you like, across the room, or from the perspective of another culture, or certainly another individual. Well, I recognize the value of that type of perspective, of gaining that type of perspective. It's something that academically was invaluable to me. Whenever I would study a religion, for example, if I would study Buddhism, it wasn't enough for me to study it from the outside. I had to enter it from the inside. I had to sort of experience what it would be like if that was my tradition, and if I was seeing the solution that it was trying to develop or articulate from within that solution. Same thing for Christianity, same thing for Judaism. When I would read novels when I was young, I remember doing this with great expectations, in particular the Charles Dickens novel. I would read it so slowly, because with every character and with every character's dialogue, I would try to sort of step inside that character and see that novel at that point from the perspective of that character. So it's been, when, I think Eric at the beginning mentioned that I've done work in a number of different fields. I don't do those activities as a dilettante, in the sense that I'm not dabbling. I don't find that helpful. What I find helpful, even and ultimately for philosophy, is that when I am doing another field, work in another field, if I'm writing poetry, I'm not writing poetry as a philosopher trying to express ideas in poetic form. I'm writing poetry as I imagine a poet to write poetry. So that, for example, when I go through a stage of writing philosophy, the ideas are coming to me. And the ideas are coming to me in the form of aphorisms. When I'm writing poetry, I'll go through a period where the first line of poems will come to me. And the first line of the poem is, for me, dictated not by the ideas and not even by the images, but by the rhythm of that poem, so of that line. So when I'm in a poetry phase, I'm in a phase where I am attentive primarily to the rhythm of the language. When I'm writing philosophy, I'm attentive to the intellectual content, the ideas of the language. But I'm not doing poetry as a philosopher. I'm not writing philosophy as a poet. So perspective is valuable in enriching. And then obviously at the end of the day, that experience writing poetry does in fact infuse the philosophy, but it sort of infuses the philosophy in a more organic way. It makes, the aphorisms are still there as statements of rigorous thought, but they will have an element of music. And I've even had people, and that element of music will in fact communicate at a level that I would not have been able to achieve had I not had the experience of writing poetry as a poet. I've had people, in fact, I've done art shows where I'll have like artwork within the middle of the gallery, and on the walls, there'll be aphorisms of maybe one of the books I've written. And I've had people say to me afterwards that they didn't fully understand the intellectual content of the aphorisms. They can be hard because they're very concentrated. But they've said they've communicated through the music of their words. Okay. But that's something that, for me, is only achievable by, again, writing poetry seriously as a poet. When I paint, I don't paint to illustrate philosophical ideas, though in the end, those philosophical ideas will sort of enter the work, but I'm painting attentive to color and how line is achieved and how form is achieved. I'm not trying to illustrate. But that's helpful. Achieving that kind of perspective is helpful. But what's decisive philosophically is, even though we can be a tourist and sort of like enter other people's sort of experiences a little bit or perspectives a little bit, rigorously at the end of the day, to be able to fully sense another human being, it's not enough to walk in their shoes. It is not enough to occupy their skin. It would have been necessary to have been born into their skin and never have been born in ours. That is the level of rigorous demand. We cannot in principle do that. And that means that in principle, we cannot ever have a rigorously accurate sense of another's circumstances, another's temptations, another's life, another's challenges, not rigorously, not in principle. And what that means is that rigorously, we cannot judge. We don't know and cannot know. So here's another example where there's a religious admonition, a Christian admonition, judge not lest ye be judged. It's like it's a type of admonition from God. It's a divine commandment, as it were. Philosophy achieves the same result, but achieves it rigorously, not based on any relationship in faith or in belief to anything outside of a rigorous representation of our circumstances. That any difference between us and anyone else means that we are not able perfectly and rigorously and adequately to assess and comment on and evaluate that person's circumstances. That's the nature of our dignity. That's the nature of our existence. The fact that we exist at all is that we exist in difference from other people. That is our fundamental dignity. We cannot be exchanged with anyone else. That is what makes our circumstances absolutely unique and singular, and that's what means that whatever has applied to anyone else need not apply to us. Every concept, including mortality, including death. That's the rigor of our circumstance. That's the ultimate nature of our world. Okay, next question. Let me see here. Okay, stress comes mainly from uncertainty. What is uncertainty? What does uncertainty do to us? What are our resources to master it? Okay. We live in terms of false certainties. We imagine, we presume that the future will resemble the past, and we live in terms of that. We can't know that, and by presuming that, by imagining that, we suffer. We suffer horribly. There's an aphorism I wrote at the beginning of writing philosophy. The philosophy, my philosophical work, is difficult. The alternative, unbearable. The common sense of death, death is oblivion. The common sense of death cannot be born. Well, I ask people, what would it be like to live in a world in which death was not certain? Rigorously. That's this world. And it's more important to recognize that than to think that you know what's going to happen tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and at the end of time. You don't know that. And what you cannot know, in principle, do not claim. And even if you turn out to be right about the future, that's not the point. The point is what you know rigorously right here, right now. That's what matters, and that's what frees us. So ultimately, I was talking, and I think this leads into the next question about, in a time of uncertainty, what's the one certainty, the only certainty, the only rigorous certainty? Philosophy. I mean, we might have confidence in other things. We might have confidences in our beliefs, confidences in our opinions, confidences in our faith, but at the level of rigor, the limit of rigor, the absolute precision of what we can absolutely know for sure, we can't know those things for sure. And assuming and embracing what you cannot know for sure is one of the ways of representing the ultimate source of human pain and suffering. So philosophy is the one certainty. Now, you might say, okay, but you're sort of denying, the existence, the ability to know a lot of things. Well, the only things that we're denying, the only things that we're tearing down are houses of cards. And there's a Buddhist admonition that is in the same spirit of the philosophical. Buddhism is not philosophy. Buddhism contains at its core certain beliefs that are not rigorous, but a lot of its conclusions are in the same direction as the philosophical. So there's a Buddhist admonition: don't seek reality, seek to put an end to opinion. Well, opinion is anything that we cannot rigorously know. Anything that we cannot know with absolute certainty, absolute confidence. Among those things that we can't know is that we will die. Sorry, we can't know that. Even in terms of, and I've made this comment in other settings, if someone dies, even our very notion of death, if someone dies, what do you know? That they will not return to the end of all time? You know that? You think you do. When you think you know what you cannot legitimately claim, you set yourself up for mental and physical pain. Next. Okay, this is a little bit of a historical question. Philosophy, okay, the question is, during an online lecture for Go Viral, that was a couple weeks ago, you mentioned that at a time of stress, of societal stress, philosophies emerge and take hold. Can you briefly elaborate on this? Okay, well, we've already seen some of the bases for philosophy being attractive during a time of stress. For one thing, at a very kind of lofty level, stress is a survival response. Philosophy seeks salvation, something complete here and now, a complete solution that is independent of all possible future experience. Right? So philosophy is going in the opposite direction to what is bringing stress about. We've also seen that philosophy has the ability, again, at the limit of rigor, that's what my experiences with acrophobia, and other contexts, physical pain have demonstrated for me, has the ability to control at will these sort of anxieties and stresses. The major sort of historical kind of precedent for some of these developments, Socrates himself emerged, and and Socrates is really the start of Western philosophy, and that comment that he makes at the after his conviction and sentencing to death, so we go our separate ways, you live and I to die, and which is better, only God knows. That is really the moment that Western philosophy begins. Socrates himself emerged right after the Peloponnesian Wars in Greece, a time of real social, political turmoil, in his culture. That gave rise right after him to Plato, who was his student, that wrote about Socrates. Kind of most of what we know of Socrates comes from Plato, and Aristotle. So that was in response, those philosophical writings emerged right after that kind of tumult of the Peloponnesian War. Schopenhauer was a major philosopher who emerged in the early 19th century. He was actually the philosopher who had the strongest influence on the young Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is probably the person I consider to be the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. He's the philosopher who most influenced me, along with Kierkegaard, the first main existentialist philosopher. Schopenhauer emerged, became prominent in his 70s, right after the Napoleonic Wars, that period of stress and turmoil. And after World War II, the philosophical tradition, beginning with Kierkegaard and sort of flowering with writers like Camus and Sartre, existentialism, became a dominant kind of philosophical presence. But we see, like, what the appeal is of philosophy during any time, right? It's the one intellectual effort that attempts to achieve a rigorous representation that is independent of circumstance, generally, that is unchallengeable no matter what. And again, as an illustration of that, past can't guarantee the future, future decides the past. Those are incontrovertible. And philosophy actually isn't really that dogmatic about what it considers to be incontrovertible, in the sense that our sense of what's rigorous has evolved over time. And if it turns out that some of the propositions that I'm advancing as rigorous turn out in future time to be seen as not so, that's okay. All that matters is the essential claim that it is rigor that we want and rigor that we need, and only rigor that rises really to the level of what we might hope for in a God or in divinity. If God is anything, he or she or it is a God of rigor, a God of precision, where and we talked about rigor in terms of difference. When we say that any difference matters, what we're also saying is that everything matters. And that when we abstract from things, we leave out details. Those details that we're leaving out are helpful when we're building models, like in the sciences. They're helpful when we're doing economics. They're not helpful when we're doing philosophy. Philosophy leaves nothing out. And they're not helpful when we're interested in achieving a complete solution right here, right now, and independent of all future experience, because that solution depends upon what distinguishes us from everything else. That becomes the dignity and the freedom of our circumstance. I mean, the single most important thing is, as you look around, what you are experiencing, each one of you, has not ever been experienced and will not ever be experienced by any other human being or anything in the history of the world and in worlds to come. Not ever. That singularity of circumstance is probably the single most important aspect of our circumstance. And we're not typically like thinking in those terms. We're seeing objects and we think that, well, okay, those objects that we're seeing, the chairs, the tables, other people see those chairs and tables, they might see them from different angles. But for philosophy, it's limit of precision, limit of rigor. They're not seeing them from exactly your position, and that is what matters. And that is ultimately the basis of salvation, because that establishes the difference between you and everything else. It establishes your existence, it establishes your dignity, and it is the basis for your being able to escape from whatever has been a limitation, a perceived limitation for others. Okay. So philosophies emerge in times of stress, partly because philosophy is the most powerful response to stress, as it's the most powerful response to our circumstance generally. And it's the most powerful response, not just because of the nature of its claims, but because, well, not just because of the specific form of its claims, but that its claims are rigorous. And so a place of absolute certainty and absolute safety. Now, what is that place? Where we are, where each of us is right now, in its detail. There's a very consoling Hindu lullaby that Hindu mothers would tell to their children before bed. Child, you are yourself when you sleep and when you dream, and even when you are awake. Look at the world going by. Now that's a view of, that's a philosophical view that is seeing the world from where that individual is. One can say that another way to represent the source of human suffering, the source of our problems, is the tendency to think that we can see the world from outside the world. Our sense of reality is based upon that notion of a world that's there, whether we're here or not, as if we could know. Our sense of death is just such a world. The whole point of existentialism, and when I met with those professors, those philosophy professors that asked me like what philosophy was, one of them was an existentialist. was her area of focus was existentialism. And I said to her, you know, I haven't met anybody that, nor have I read anything that suggests a real deep, true understanding of existentialism, ever. And of course she asked me, so what's existentialism? And I said, the circumstance we cannot leave the world to view the world. That's all. But it turns out that modern physics at its highest, the work of Einstein, the work of Heisenberg, is simply the physics of existentialism. The physics of the world from within the world. And just to illustrate that quickly, in terms of its relation to that Hindu lullaby that's so consoling, and that's a philosophical embrace, you know, of the reality of our circumstance. Children now learn that the earth rotates on its axis and moves around the sun. I actually recently, with one of my students, calculated the speeds. It's rotating on its axis. We are moving in a circle at about 1,000 miles an hour. We are moving around the sun at about roughly 67,000 miles an hour. Okay? And the view of, you know, the view of our solar system, the view of our Earth is that, you know, again, we're rotating and we're moving around the sun, and the other planets are moving around the sun. That's the view of our solar system, of our world, since people like Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler and Newton. That's the whole sort of development of modern science, modern physics, modern astronomy. It's wrong. The question arises, the fundamental question, if we're moving, why don't we feel that we're moving? And the answer that's been given is something called the principle of inertia, which in this context reduces to, we don't feel that we're moving when we're moving because we don't feel that we're moving when we're moving. It's not an explanation. The explanation didn't come until Einstein. And the explanation is that we don't feel that we're moving because we're not moving. There's no experiment that we can perform to demonstrate that we are in fact in motion. To be able to make that claim is effectively to be imagining that we can see the world from outside the world. We can leave our skin, see ourselves on a rotating earth, moving around the sun, but see ourselves as if we were across the room, across the galaxy. We can't do that. The work of Einstein recognizes that. Existentialism recognizes that we cannot leave the world to view the world. All Einstein was doing, all Heisenberg was doing in developing quantum mechanics was developing the physics of existentialism, the physics of our circumstance that we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside, that philosophical reality begins and ends from where we incontestably are. Right here, right now. The solution to the world has to pertain right here, right now, at every possible point, independent of whatever happens next, or it exists nowhere and for no one. The fact that philosophy exists at all, the fact that the limits of rigor are capable of being explored, as I've been indicating to you, attests to the fact that it is possible to achieve those kinds of solutions. And what's impressive too is that even though our scientific tendency is to want to describe the world from the outside, to describe a reality that exists independently of ourselves, the most powerful of our physics, the most powerful of our science is the relativity work, the quantum mechanics that describes the world from within, basically is doing the philosophy of, the physics of philosophy, the physics of existentialism, the physics that makes it impossible for us rigorously to imagine ourselves outside the world. So, philosophy is powerful in and of itself. It's also powerful as a guide. I mean, it's powerful in lots of other ways. Philosophy created science. It created science almost as an afterthought, in a sense. It created the methodology of it. But philosophy operates at a higher level of rigor. And so at the highest possible level of rigor that it does in fact view the world from, it's able to generate methodologies that are less rigorous. Science is one of those methodologies. I've developed another that, because it's impossible to do a controlled experiment to rigorously compare like 2 points, I've developed an alternative called convergence theory, a complementary sort of methodology that deals with the elaboration of properties at a point. It's what I call convergence theory. It's basically the science, the technology of object formation. And it's what I used in developing actually some of my approaches in molecular biology, where I developed results that were able to redirect viruses against cancers. So as much as we see the coronavirus as a threat, it's also an opportunity. Viruses are opportunities for intervening in other disease processes. I've often said that if viruses didn't exist, we would in fact have had to create them, because they represent a very powerful, actually a species we might call of smart chemotherapeutics. We just have to manipulate them. And if we can, as we can manipulate them, you know, at the level that we now can, again, I'm optimistic that we will be able to intervene, you know, with molecular biological approaches for treatments and vaccines against coronavirus. So, yeah, so, but philosophy is powerful in terms of what it does at the limit of rigor, but it's also powerful in terms of the applications it can generate that can help us in other ways, help us survive in this world as science helps us survive in this world. Okay, now, let me see, a couple more questions here. Okay, how do you apply all your knowledge or skills to live through this time yourself? What keeps you optimistic, if so, about the future? Okay. I think I've talked a lot about, you know, how I sort of live my own philosophical work. What I do, though, is, like I mentioned, I rejected Stoicism because I felt that it was a bit of an emotional, intellectual prison, that I wanted to feel free to experience life in all its extremes, all its dimensions, insofar as I could, and only introduce the philosophy in time of desperate need. If one reaches that point, that relationship with philosophy, it turns out that philosophy is strong enough that one virtually never has to invoke it at all. I did not invoke it to deal with my father's death. I invoked it to test its power at that moment. The same thing happened during the earthquake. The Northridge earthquake of 1994. I was in an area in the San Fernando Valley that was, because of its position near foothills in the southern part of the valley, apparently the area that experienced the second greatest intensity of ground shaking after Northridge itself. So my apartment building was effectively destroyed. And in fact, most of the buildings on my street were condemned. And it felt, within the experience of that earthquake that lasted for about 45 seconds, that I was going to die. Okay? I ran that aphorism that I mentioned earlier, selflessness, how one acts not out of need, through my mind to test it, see if it would work. It didn't work. I was like, this is an extreme set of circumstances that's going to take something stronger. I went to, at that point, a fundamental sort of set of aphorisms, one that dealt with sort of a logical aspect of the philosophy that I had done. The meaning of the world is its most general representation, something that I don't so much talk about anymore, but it was an aphorism that at the time was at the foundation of my philosophical work. I ran that through my mind. The pain, the anxiety, the fear, it just went away like a switch. Now, I've told people, and I've lived this repeatedly, if at any point I were to invoke my philosophical work in that way, in some extreme set of circumstances, extreme pain, physical pain, extreme anguish, extreme loss, the loss of my father, my last family member. And the philosophy didn't work like a switch to end that pain, that anguish, that fear, whatever I was experiencing. I wouldn't be here now in talking about this. I would have abandoned the philosophical work as inadequate to our circumstances. The only reason why I am talking about it, the only reason why I will continue to talk about it, is that it has not ever failed to act as a switch whenever I've invoked it. So, but I find it's so strong, I don't have to invoke it. I haven't invoked it during this crisis. I don't remember the last time I did. So basically, I live the philosophy, but I both live it, but I don't see the world daily through it. It doesn't prevent me from experiencing life in its full range of emotions. Even in preparing for this talk, I get nervous before these talks. I had an acting coach when I was doing this play, and she's philosophically attuned. She'll say to me, Stephen, why don't you just invoke the philosophy? And I could. But for me, the anxiety is part of my preparatory process, and I don't want to interrupt that. So the strength of the philosophy for me is my ability not to have to use it. But it is there. And there's always the possibility of encountering some extremity of circumstance where I will have to go to it. But part of its strength, I will say, is that when I don't set out to write philosophy, it comes to me. Like the aphorisms are always sort of working themselves beneath the surface, and then they emerge and I write them down. Okay. But it's taken years to get to that point. There was a time, a few decades ago, when I would sit down and write philosophy. And this was, after I discovered that there was a connection between philosophy and human suffering, and its ability to address it, control it, make it voluntary. Well, when I would sit down to write philosophy, I would say to myself, okay, really imagine yourself buried alive. Imagine yourself burned with third-degree burns over 90% of your body. Really imagine yourself out in the middle of empty space, drifting to your inevitable death. Imagine this. Put yourself in those circumstances and put themselves, and just clothe yourself in that situation, then write philosophy. It was not enough for me to generate results that would be effective against a headache or the anguish of a headache. It had to be effective at the extremity of our circumstances. One of the first works I did early on was actually a film, Torture, where I wanted to address that extremity of circumstance. Philosophy has to rise even to the occasion of torture to death. If it doesn't, you throw it away. So it's ever present for me, but it's there. It's not constraining my vision. Philosophy for me is not a prison. It's a freedom. And it allows me to experience life as it presents itself. So, yes. And the last of these questions, what are your suggestions for those who feel stressed during the COVID-19 pandemic? Oh, actually, I'm sorry. What keeps you optimistic about the future? I wanted to address that. Yes. Rigorously, any difference in past circumstance and present is different in many ways from past circumstance, means that anything that has been true in the past need not be true in the future, in the moment to come. We cannot ever rigorously justify despair. Cannot ever rigorously justify giving up. Not ever. Not because of any kind of hope or faith, because of the absolute rigor of our circumstance. That when it comes to rigor, any difference is decisive. It's the same issue with the battering rammer, with the boy who's banging his head against the wall. That boy has no reason to despair, because every time he hits his head against the wall, the circumstance is now different than it was the previous time. And that next time, or the time after that, could be the decisive one. Every difference is decisive. Any difference is decisive. The fact that others have failed does not ever imply that we must fail, because any difference between the circumstance of someone else and the circumstance of ourselves is enough rigorously to mean that what has applied to them need not apply to us. Where others have failed, we can succeed. So just despair cannot exist within a philosophical space. I wanted to say that. Okay, and then finally here, what are your suggestions for those who feel stressed during the COVID-19 pandemic? Okay. Obviously, I've given a lot of guidelines here. I know that this talk is not sufficient for people to fully embrace necessarily a philosophical vision. It's taken me a long time to cultivate it, and it's taken me a long time to assimilate these results and to discover their power. But I have had experiences with individuals where one aphorism will be transformative. And I have lots of aphorisms. I have a website. It's called thebooksofjoshua.com. And it has lots of my writings, hundreds of things, lots of aphorisms. I can't ever anticipate what aphorism might be helpful or transformative for somebody, but many have been. So there's that resource. I think it's important to keep in mind the power of some of philosophy's offshoots, the power of science, the power of molecular biology. I'm very hopeful. Again, the past cannot guarantee the future and cannot limit it. So the fact that we have not developed vaccines against various viruses does not mean that we can't have the decisive breakthrough tomorrow, the next day, and not necessarily even with vaccines, but with therapeutics, with strong therapeutics, with new kinds of therapeutics. So I'm very hopeful in that regard. Above all, I would stress the fundamental recognition of our circumstance, that we exist in difference from everything else, from everyone else. That fundamental difference is our fundamental dignity, our fundamental singularity, our fundamental possibility, and the fundamental path to what the religions have called salvation. That philosophy is the one thing that's always present, that's incontrovertible, and so is stronger than anything we have to face, anything we have to deal with. So I encourage more exploration of philosophy. It's not a system of belief. It's not a matter of faith. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of incontrovertible rigor, incontrovertible results about our essential circumstances. And the recognition of those circumstances is enough to liberate us from anything we might be fearing, anything we might be despairing. So I see philosophy as the ultimate source to the ultimate path out of any set of oppressive circumstances, the most powerful tool that human beings have at their disposal.
First of all, Steven, thank you very much for sharing with us your wisdom and thoughts tonight. I know it's very late in Los Angeles. It's almost 11 o'clock at night. We really appreciate this. For those that were not able to participate in this Zoom meeting, it is recorded, and we will post it on our social media platforms. But really appreciate everyone participating. And Steven, again, thank you so much for all of your insight and everything that you have shared with us tonight. This was a wonderful discussion and presentation, and we're very grateful. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And again, I want to wish you a public happy birthday. So, yes.
Okay. Thank you. And stay well and healthy, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for participating. Have a great day. Bye.